Okay, so we were talking about the story of Rebecca's twins and Rebecca's pregnancy. And in Rebecca's pregnancy, there was a problem. The problem was that Vayitro, the verse says that the pregnancy was very difficult. The precise translation here is, let's take a peek. Precise translation in the art scroll, I should say, the children agitated within her. So it was difficult pregnancy. So what did she do? So she goes to speak to Hashem. In other words, to speak to God. How do you speak to God? So Rashi says it's the prophet. Verse 22, Rashi says that the children are agitated within her. The verse says, and she said, if so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of Hashem. So she asks God, so Rashi says, she went to the school of Shem. Shem is a descendant of Noach. So according to the rabbinic tradition, Noach's descendants, the children of Shem, of which Abraham is one, they establish a school, and he has students that carry and understand the oneness of Hashem. So they're considered the prophets of the time. So she goes to the study house of Shem to inquire of Hashem. So what does Hashem say? Hashem says, verse 23, and Hashem said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 regimes from your inside shall be separated. The might shall pass from one regime to the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. Yeah. And the elder will serve the younger. So that is what she is told. We assume that that's okay because that makes her happy, right? That's it. That's the end of the conversation. So the question we asked last week is, why was she pacified and comforted by this information? So we mentioned last week that there is this cute idea that some people say, and that is based on Rashi. Rashi says that what was so agitating about twins? I never had twins. I assume it's difficult, but we assume she's not the only one that had twins. So what was so agitating? So Rashi says that when she passed the houses of worship, of idol worship, she would feel that the child is agitating to get out. And when she passes the houses of Torah study, again, the holy places of Shem's yeshiva, etc., then she feels like the child wants to get out. So she feels like internally there's a confusion here. So now she goes, so that's what Rashi says. So now she hears that there's two children, then she is happy and pacified, so to speak. So that's so one interpretation is, she's happy, at least the child is not confused. You'd rather have if you have 2 children, one is if one child that can't make up his mind where he wants to be, in that sense, that's problematic. If you have 2 children and each one takes a different path, in some sense, that's more comforting. That is what they told us when we were growing up. I'm not sure. I'm convinced that I always like that interpretation until I become a parent, right? If you're a parent, it's a very difficult interpretation to accept. Let's assume somebody tells you that you're going to have 2 children. One is going to be very successful and make it into an Ivy League school, and the other one is going to suffer terribly or become lost and confused. So, as a parent, is that can be comforting for you? Maybe yeah, maybe no. Some people say, at least I was successful. At least I was successful. A part of my job. But I don't know that everybody would be comforted. So the question here is, how was this comforting to her? Assuming it's comforting. I mean, I don't know. Maybe she wasn't comforted, but that she doesn't complain after that. She doesn't go back to complain. So that's where we left off last week, I think, if I remember correctly. So this week, I think that there's a much deeper interpretation, and I haven't seen it written anywhere explicitly, but I think this is the correct. But before we do that, I'm going to give it a sort of we'll open the chapter, we'll read a verse, and we'll give the interpretation we'll give an interpretation of the end of the verse, and then we'll go back to the beginning and see what was the problem here. We'll see what the comfort here was. So give me just one moment, and we'll open up the screen. Okay, so what do we have here? We have here verse 23. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 kingdoms will separate from your innards, and 1 kingdom will become mightier than the other kingdom. Now, and the elder will serve the younger. So we read this verse last week. What does it mean that, let's open Rashi, why not? One kingdom will become mightier than the other kingdom. So which kingdom will become mightier? So it sounds like one, when you read the translation, it sounds like one will be stronger than the other. But Rashi says no. Rashi says it doesn't mean one is stronger than the other. It means there's always one on top and one on bottom. You never have both these kingdoms are never on the same level. So let's read Rashi. One will become mightier than the other kingdom. They will not be equal in greatness. When one rises, the other will fall. And so scripture states, Ezekiel, I shall become full from the destroyed city. Tyre, which is Tsur, which is a city in the north in Lebanon, became full, gained power only from the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, the way the rabbis understand this verse, this one will become mightier than the other, is that there's always going to be some degree of conflict between these 2 kingdoms that will emerge from Rebecca, and one will always be mightier than the other. But the thing is, which one? It depends. Sometimes Jerusalem is on top, and sometimes the opposition to Jerusalem is on top. Here they write Tyre, Tzor, but later the rabbis think of it as Rome, as we'll see earlier in the Rashi. We'll get to Rome in a minute. So here, the point here is that there is going to be there's always a conflict. One is always higher than the next. They cannot be on the same level. One is always going to be more dominant and strong than the other. That's the history. When Jerusalem is on top, the opposition to Jerusalem is down, and vice versa. If Tyre is successful, Jerusalem is empty. That's what Rashi reads. Okay, Rashi does not address the end of the verse. And the elder will serve the younger. What exactly does that mean? V'rav, the greater one, will serve the younger one. So it's not clear what that means. It could be, on a simple level, it could be that this is a reference to Jacob and Esau, because what she's saying here is, what's happening here is, the prophet is telling her 2 things. He's talking to her about her 2 children, the twins in her womb, but also about the kingdoms that will emerge and descend from them. So at the beginning of the verse, it sounds like she says, it's not just 2 children, it's 2 nations and 2 kingdoms. And then the kingdoms will one be mightier than the other. And then it sounds like the end of the verse, you could read the end of the verse is the clause of the elder will serve the younger, is talking about her own 2 children. And as we mentioned last week, that some people say that's why she wanted to orchestrate. She orchestrated later that her husband should be tricked and bless the younger one, because she got this prophecy that the older one has to serve the younger one. Okay, so that's the conventional interpretation. That is a beautiful interpretation. Then there's a beautiful interpretation of Rabbi Shamshon Nefal Hirsch. And he says like this, he says, the elder will serve the younger. How does that, he says that's also talking about the nations. That's also talking about not only Jacob and Esau as individuals, but also the kingdoms that will emerge from them, which is Israel. And as we'll see later, we'll see that the rabbis felt that Esau's descendants are Rome. So in other words, the enemies of the Jewish people at the time of the sages, they destroyed the second temple. So in the beginning, we're saying that there's going to be a conflict between these 2 kingdoms. When one emerges, when one's on top, the other is on the bottom, like a seesaw. They both cannot be on the same level. But then Rabbi Shamshon Nefal here says that when the verse says V'rav Yavod Tzar, the elder will serve the younger, it's not just the individuals that Esau will serve Jacob. Rather, it's that eventually at the end of history, Jacob will, Esau, the kingdoms that emerge from Esau will ultimately serve the Jewish people. That's what Shamshon Nefal here says. In other words, the end of the verse is not in conflict with the earlier clause, because the earlier clause says there's always going to be conflict. Each one is always trying to emerge to the top. And when one's at top, the other is on bottom. But what's going to happen is eventually the end of the verse, according to Rabbi Shamshon Hirsch, the end of the verse is that eventually the elder one is going to serve the younger one. In other words, eventually Rome and what Rome represents, Western culture, will serve Jerusalem. That's what Shamshon Hirsch says. Based on that, I think that it's a small leap to explain as follows. The reason why this is comforting is not because she is told, okay, at least one of your children are going to be holy, and your other child is not going to be, but at least to be successful 50% in 50% of your parenting. I don't think that's what the comfort is. I think the comfort is to the contrary, that the comfort is that at the end of history, there is going to be peace between both her children. So it may take millennia, it may take a very long time before Esav and Rome and the powers of Western society, which is the technology and the sciences and the physical mights. It may take time before they realize their purpose, which is to serve a spiritual purpose, but eventually that will happen. And eventually there's peace between the physical sciences and the spiritual ideas introduced by Jacob. And that's what he's saying. The greater will serve the younger. Serve, we don't mean that. We're not saying serve them, that Jacob is more dominant and stronger and enslaving them. What we mean is that the success of the older one, which is the success of the physical strength and the physical might and physical power and physical technology is here, and physical science is here for a greater purpose, to serve the ideals that Jacob introduces. So in other words, in the final analysis, going back to the question, and says, why is she comforted? By telling her that there's going to be two children and your children are going to conflict. At least from our perspective, from the perspective of the sages, one child is positive, the other child is less than positive. Roman Empire at that point is the mightiest empire, but probably the cruelest empire. So why is this so comforting that, oh, wonderful, you're going to have two children, one good and one positive, one negative? Oh, the comfort is the end of the verse. The comfort is that ultimately there's peace between them. Ultimately, human history comes to a point where there's peace. And peace not because they're both on the same level. They can never be on the same level. One, the physical and the spiritual is always a conflict if each one is trying to achieve dominance. But if each one knows their role, then there could be peace. If the physical might and the physical sciences understand that they're here for a greater purpose, that is the younger one. That's the older one serving the younger one. Why spirituality is the younger one? We'll get to that later, hopefully. So that is, I think, a nice interpretation of explaining why Rebecca is comforted. And I think that same interpretation could also be offered, maybe I'll shift here because of the sun. I think the same interpretation could be offered. Oops. I think the same interpretation could be applied within the person's own life. In other words, if you think about Jacob and Esau, we talk about the two kingdoms that emerge, Rome and Jerusalem. You could think about it as in general as physical might and spirit and spiritual enlightenment. And within the person, you also have those two forces. And within the person, there's a conflict. Am I going to pursue physical strength? Am I going to pursue physical power? Or am I going to pursue spiritual ideas, which in many cases it means suspending the ego and suspending the self and helping others, etc. So these two urges that a person has within themselves to become more physically dominant and physically powerful, or to become more spiritual, which is, in some sense, the more spiritual I become, the more I have to move away from my own physical dominance. So I have these two, in other words, a self-orientation versus self-transcendence. So I have these two powers within myself. That's the Jacob and Esau fighting within the womb of every one of us. Okay. So now who's going to win? Who's going to win? So what we're saying is that initially there's going to be conflict between the two within the person, but ultimately there's peace. Why is there peace? Because we realize that the older one, the physical might and the physical power and the physical resources that we seek to amass, if I want them to dominate for their own purpose, there'll never be peace. But if one is here to serve the other, even within the self, then there's peace, because the physical strength is here to serve the spiritual purpose. So that's the comfort we're saying. Ultimately, there's going to be peace between the two. So that's the pitch. Again, I haven't seen this written explicitly, but I think that is a nice way to read it, because it's good. It's comforting, and I'm looking for comfort. I'm looking for, if I'm Rebecca, what would comfort me? And I haven't seen anything better. So unless there's something better, this is what I'm sticking to. Okay. There's a beautiful Rashi, just to shift to historic times. And again, remember that in rabbinic literature, let's step back a second. In this story, we're going to find out what plays out is the conflict between Jacob and Esav, Yaakov and Esav. And ultimately, Esav is the older brother, and Yaakov ends up tricking the older brother and stealing the blessings. And it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. The story makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But when you have to understand it, the way the sages read the story, they think about Esav as the father of Rome. And they see the conflict between Jacob and Esav as the conflict between Rome and Jerusalem, which the sages were suffering under, for the most part, the brutality of Rome, right? The Mishnah was concluded a little after the destruction of the Second Temple a little after the destruction of the Second Temple in the hands of Rome. Many of the great sages of the Mishnah, including Rabbi Akiva and others, were killed by the Romans. So the sages experienced tremendous and terrible brutality and persecution under Rome. So from this perspective of the sages, this battle between Rome and Jerusalem is a manifestation of the battle between Jacob and Esav, that is told to Rebecca in the beginning that there's going to be a conflict between the two. So this is the fulfillment of the prophecy to Rebecca in the eyes of the sages. Keeping that in mind is an absolutely beautiful Rashi. What does Rashi say? God tells her, Shnei goyim bebitnech. Two nations are in your womb, right? The word is goyim. Goy is nation. Goyim plural is nations. So Rashi says the words goyim, which is nations, the way it's spelled in the Torah, it's not spelled with a vav, which would make it goyim. It's spelled Gimel Yud Yud Mem. I'm pointing on the screen if you want to see it. It's not spelled the Goyim the way this is how you would announce nations. It's spelled differently. It's spelled like Geyim. Geyim, not Goyim, which is pronounced like Geyim, exalted persons. Meaning you have two exalted people in your womb. In addition to the simple interpretation, which means Shnei Goyim, two nations, we're also talking about she's also receiving a prophecy about two individual exalted people. That's what Rashi quotes the Medrash quotes the Talmud. Who are these? These were Antoninus and Rabbi Judah the Prince, from whose tables neither radishes nor lettuce were lacking, either in the summer or in the winter. From Avodah Zarah, from Tractate Avodah Zarah. In the olden days, today, if you want to have all year round, you can go and you can buy all types of fruits and vegetables, because everything is shipped in from around the world. And if you're really very sophisticated, then you only buy seasonal vegetables from your region. But for that, you have to be like, really, I don't know what the word is. You have to be really aware. But you go into Whole Foods, you go into any grocery store, you buy vegetables all year, you have all the vegetables. But in the ancient world, that was a sign of tremendous wealth. To be able to buy an avocado in the middle of the winter is a sign of tremendous wealth, because who's importing this kind of stuff? So what Rashi says is, that according to the Talmud, that there's two exalted people. Who are these two exalted people? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who was a great sage, and he was actually the author of the Mishnah, first book of the Oral Torah. And he had a friend. His friend was the Roman Caesar named Antoninus. And at that point, that was a brief time, and that's why the Mishnah was able to be written then, because there was a brief time where the Roman government actually allowed Judaism to flourish in Israel, because there was a personal connection, a personal friendship between Rebbe, the greatest sage of the time, and Antoninus, the Roman Caesar. And there's many stories in the Talmud about their relationship. And they had a great relationship. So in addition to the story to the prophecy, as there's going to be the conflict between Rome and Jerusalem, which is true and is ongoing, and because that represents the conflict not just between Rome and Jerusalem, but more broadly between the physical and the spiritual. According to the sages, according to the Talmud, the fact that the Torah spells these words with Yud, Shnei Goyim, not Shnei Goyim, not two nations, but two exalted people, that same verse is actually also alluding to the peace, to the similarity between the two, and the brief period of time earlier in history, which those two people were on the same page, which allowed for the flourishing of the Mishnah of the oral Torah, which allowed for Judaism to survive till today. And that's alluded to in the beginning of the verse, before the conflict. And I think what that is basically a prelude to what's going to happen at the end of the verse, where once again, eventually, we're going to come back to that same harmony that was represented between Antoninus and Rebbe, between the sages and the powers of Rome. And it's just funny that you always express the ideas with food. We're Jews, right? So if we're saved, we're going to eat something. How do you explain somebody is great? You say, well, they're so great that all year round they have what was the vegetables? All year round they have lettuce and radishes. So now, next time you walk into the store, you should feel very wealthy, because you're like the greatest wealthy people in Israel and Rome in the ancient times. You can eat lettuce all year round. Okay, so that I think is nice. Also, because again, when you read these verses, and especially when you read the commentary of the sages, they're speaking in code. Remember, they're living under Roman persecution, right? So they can't spell everything out. They can't really say everything how they feel. But when they say that there's two exalted people, Rome and Jerusalem, Rebbe and Antoninus, what they're really saying is, look, we have an example where what's going to happen in the future, where the might of Rome and the power of and the spirituality of Jerusalem don't have to be in conflict. Throughout history, they're in conflict, but ultimately they will not be. And we got a taste of that in the time when the Mishnah was written, where there was respect from the Romans to the Jewish people, and therefore Rebbe, with his wealth, was able to facilitate decades of peace and Torah scholarship that would produce the Mishnah, and ultimately that's the root of the Talmud, and basically preserve Torah scholarship for almost 2,000 years, leading us to the end of history when Rav and the greater one will serve the younger one. So I think that this is, even though on the surface it looks like a verse full of conflict, and we cannot ignore the conflict of Jewish history, we cannot ignore the conflict of Rome and Jerusalem, especially if Rome is Western Europe, is as a Western culture, and Europe and Western Europe and then Eastern Europe, all the persecution that happens. And again, in the sages' perspective, that's all the descendants of Rome, of Esav. And even today, the sages view themselves as we're in the exile of Rome, because we're not in Rome, we're in France and Germany, and then we're in Eastern Europe. But that's all Rome. That's the heirs of the Roman Empire. And in that sense, so it was a very difficult history, but it doesn't have to be that way, because both in the beginning of the verse and the end of the verse allude to the peace that is possible. And harmony, not just peace, but harmony. But harmony doesn't happen, they're never the same. Even when you have harmony within the world and within your own soul, between your physical and spiritual, it can never be, well, we're making peace. I give my physical part 50% of the time, I give my spiritual part 50% of the time. Doesn't work. Each one wants complete dominance. The only way you can have peace is if there is a recognition that the physical is serving the spiritual. The spiritual will never agree to serve the physical, and the physical has to find expression, has to allow its success, but it has to be a higher purpose, because physical might and the sciences and technology without a higher purpose will never be peaceful. Ultimately, it's always going to be self-destructive. So it always has to be harnessed to a higher purpose. And if you don't harness it to a higher purpose, it's not going to be peaceful. So that's the pitch for verse 23, which I think is a beautiful verse. It's also tragic. Not in the sense of tragedy. It's also sad. It's also embodies all of the conflict that the Jewish people experienced for 2,000 years of persecution, but it also has the optimism and also the idea that we already had a taste of that, so it's possible to create that harmony. So that's the story in short, a lot more to say, but Vicky, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. I had a small question about the Rashi. So usually he gives the pshat or no? Because the pshat here is two people is Jacob and Esau, right?
No, the pshat is Shnei Goyim, two nations. So the verse, you see, let's look at verse 22. Let me share the screen again.
Right.
You know,
But even if he says two people, it could be Jacob and Esau, right?
yes, but that's not the simple meaning of the verse, right? That's not the simple meaning of the verse. Simple meaning of the verse is nations. Problem is, nations are written as individuals. So what the Medrash is doing, what Rashi is doing from the Talmud is saying, if we're talking about the individuals in Jacob and Esau, why do you have to mention it, allude to it within the nations? So I think what Rashi is doing is Rashi is saying within the nations that emerge from Yaakov and Esau, within those nations, let's point at two individuals that are going to be able to embody the peace and the harmony that we're going to get at the end of the verse. So if it just says individuals, then it's Yaakov and Esau. If it just says nations, it's Rome and Jerusalem, Rome and Judea, or Jerusalem, or Israel, call it what you want. But now that we're saying nations, and within the word nations, within the spelling of that word, we're alluding to individuals. So we're looking for individuals that are part of those nations, not Yaakov and Esau themselves. So that's if I had to defend Rashi, that's how I would do it. I never thought about it until you mentioned it, but I think that's nice. I think I'm starting to like what I said. Maybe it's a sign that I'm getting old, but I'm starting to like what I said. I think that you're alluding to the individuals in a word that implies nations. So we're talking about individuals that of those nations that will emerge from Jacob and Esau, as opposed to Jacob and Esau himself. Now, Jacob and Esau themselves, did they make peace in their own lifetime? That is a very difficult question to answer. They had a rocky relationship. They also had that up and down. They did have a moment of peace between them two as individuals when they embraced, at least according to some of the sages. That's the subject of a later discussion when Jacob and Esau embrace. So, but there's no question that the relationship between these two brothers is, for the most part, it looks more like the conflict between the kingdoms, that they're not going to be equal in greatness. But when one emerges on top, the other one feels that they're below, and that's a constant conflict. And for the most part, I think that's how they live their life. There may be brief moments of harmony, but it doesn't seem that tragically, it doesn't seem like that lasts too long.
Thank you.
Okay, the big question becomes, how is it? It's not a big question, but it's interesting that somebody like a parents, the patriarchs of the Jewish people, like Isaac and Rebecca, would give birth to somebody like Esau. Now, I understand when you read the simple reading of the story, it sounds like Esau, doesn't sound like Esau is so terrible. Sounds like he's a little bit misguided and a little bit ADD and a little bit not into this intensive study, so he likes to hunt, but he doesn't come across as some terrible guy. But according to the interpretation of the sages, Esau is much more cunning than that and much more negative. So without getting into that right now, without getting into that specific right now, why we read Esau that way. But the issue here is he's certainly not righteous. Now, where does this come? How do you get this within Rebecca and Esau, who are both super righteous? So if you look at the previous generation, you see that there are two sons, one more righteous than the other. You have Isaac and you have Ishmael. But that's not such a great question. I mean, that's understood. Why? Because there's two mothers. And you have Sarah is a righteous woman, and she's the mother of Isaac. And then you have Hagar, who's an Egyptian maidservant, who gives birth to Ishmael. So it's not surprising that Ishmael's character is less than righteous and less than complete, because his mother was not necessarily a righteous woman, even though we talked about her. She's pretty impressive in her own right, in the sense that she sees prophecy at least twice. So God speaks to her, the angel speaks to her. But she's the maidservant, and she's Egyptian, and she was an idol worshiper. So we understand where Ishmael would emerge. Okay, but here you have the Isaac and Rebecca. Isaac and Rebecca both, where do you get Esav from?
How about great parents?
Oh, so some people want to throw Rebecca under the bus and say, yeah, Rebecca herself may be righteous, but what about her lineage? She's coming from her father as Bethuel, idol worshippers. So Isaac is sort of the pure one, and Rebecca is the one whose lineage is problematic, who gives birth to Esav. That's what gives birth to Esav. That's what some people want to interpret, and actually, some people want to interpret that. But I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to say is like this, based on the Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation has a very interesting interpretation, but to introduce that, you want to introduce one more subtlety. And that is that the Medrash says, again, the Medrash says that by Yitzhak Tatsu, they were fighting. They were fighting. The two kids were fighting in her womb. What were they fighting about? They were agitating. What were they agitating about? By Yitzhak Tatsu, they were agitating. So the Medrash says like this: the reason why the pregnancy was so difficult, because the two children were fighting, quote, over the inheritance of two worlds. That is what the Medrash says. Seems like they're fighting of who will inherit both worlds. What's both worlds? This world, the physical world, and the world to come. That's the quote. In other words, there's two perspectives here dominating. Each one wants dominance of the two worlds. The problem with, okay, fine, very nice, very nice. So in other words, it's not just the two little babies here, but it's really the consciousness of Esav's soul and the consciousness of Jacob's soul. They're fighting. They each want both worlds. Okay, but so that's the Medrash. Okay, what is the Medrash really saying? And just to drill down on the question, what does it mean that each one wants both? I understand that Jacob wants both. He wants spirituality. He wants the world to come. And he also wants to survive in this world. Why not? You got to survive in this world to be able to live to the world to come. So Jacob wants both worlds. But what does it mean that Esav wants both worlds? Esav understands physical might and physical strength and physical power. That's what Esav wants. Esav wants the afterlife. Esav doesn't believe, it doesn't understand the afterlife because it's spiritual and abstract. So what does it mean that Esav also wants both worlds? Now, to make the question a little stronger, I'm not just sitting here and putting out questions to buy time. Later on in the story, you will see that Esav doesn't care about the abstract at all, right? What does he do? What story am I alluding to? You know this. The fact that later, well, maybe you're coming with an open mind to the story, so you forgot about it. But we know later he sells his birthright, right? And Rashi interprets the interpretation. Esav says, "I'm going to die. What do I need birthright for?" We'll get to that, what that verse means. But the bottom line is, I'm a physical person. Once I die, there's no more physical existence. Don't talk to me about spiritual existence, about birthright, about abstract concepts, spiritual concepts. They don't talk to me. Talk to me about things that I have in this world. That's the personality of Esav, as we know.
He also has a godly soul, whether he is aware of it or not.
Yeah, but could you say, we're looking at Esav's life, could you say that Esav is a person who keeps saying, I don't care about the abstract. I'm willing to sell the birthright that I already have. So you can tell me in the womb, meaning in his subconscious, he also wants the spirituality. He doesn't want the spirituality. So you're right. You're right. Ultimately, you're right. Yeah, the answer is he does want spirituality. That's what we're saying here. So what are we really saying here? We're saying that both Esav and Jacob, both of them are holy, have the potential to be holy, and both want both worlds. Now, going back to Jacob, going back to the question I started with, how was it possible that righteous people like Isaac and Rebekah should have a quote unquote difficult, rebellious, a challenged child like Esav? So the Hasidic answer is like this. But to give the Hasidic answer, we use terms from Maimonides. Maimonides, when he talks about his philosophy about what's the right way to live, he says that there's a question of which quality is greater. Is it what he calls hachasid ha'me'ula, which is basically a pious person who is elevated and spiritual, or is the greater quality of life, in other words, the greater spiritual quality, somebody who he calls hakovesh es yitzray, someone who has to conquer their own his evil inclination. In other words, someone who has negative impulses and has to overcome them. So there's two people. There's a person who's not challenged, who's spiritually sensitive to begin with, and there's somebody else who is challenged and is drawn to negativity, but is able to overcome the negative drive and the negative desire and do the right thing. And Maimonides thinks about this and says, what's the better path? It's not such an easy question to answer. I mean, if you learn Tanya, as we do on Friday, you're going to be a little bit persuaded. Your perspective is tainted because Rabbi Shneur Zalman likes the challenge. But the reality is that from Maimonides' perspective, if you had a choice to pick what's the greater quality, it's not exactly clear. Each one has an advantage. Says the Hasidic commentary, Jacob and Esav. Maybe Esav failed in his life. He wasn't able to fulfill his potential. Probably, granted, fine. But in the origin, in the subconscious, in the womb of Rebecca, it's not a question of one bad, one good. That's not the question. It's one was not challenged. One was created in a form of being spiritually sensitive. And the other one is created as Esav, as spiritually challenged. But why was he created as spiritually challenged? Not because he's wicked. To the contrary, because God is giving him an opportunity to achieve a greater quality than perfection and spiritual serenity, where a person is not challenged. Rather, he is God creates Esav, a challenged individual, so that if he chooses to do the right path, he's going to reach the greater quality, as Maimonides describes. So the point here is both Esav and Jacob are two paths of the service of God, the way God creates us. God creates some people who are, as the verse itself will describe in a minute, each time a wholesome person. Wholesome, Rashi says, anyone who's not sharp to trick people. In other words, he's fine, he's happy, he's sitting in the tents studying Torah. That's his personality. He's not being pulled anywhere. So that's one path. But Esav's path is far more intriguing, far more difficult, but far more intriguing, and actually, in some sense, far greater. The potential is much greater. Now, Esav as an individual may have not lived up to it, but that's Esav's own free choice. But you say, where does this emerge in Rebecca? Where does this emerge in the parents? Yes, of course, the holy parents are going to have a challenged child, because God is giving that child an opportunity to grow even greater than Jacob was. So that's the notion of the two sons, how they come to such holy parents. Now let's go back to the Medrash. The Medrash says that what does it mean that children are agitating? Because they're both fighting over both worlds. Oh, Vicky is right. Jacob's subconscious, he wants the spiritual world as well. The fact that he's created in a way that naturally all he wants is the physical world, and in his consciousness, he's prone and he's drawn to understanding only physical qualities, and anything that's abstract and intangible doesn't speak to him, is ready to sell it for a pot of lentils, for a bowl of lentil soup, right? So obviously that just shows just that scene that he's selling his birthright, whatever that means. We'll talk about it. But selling for birthright for a bowl of soup, it's just this guy is completely in the tangible. If something is not tangible, it's meaningless to him. But that's what it looks like Esav is. But the Medrash is telling you, no, in the womb, both are fighting for both worlds. Both are fighting to highlight what's more dominant, what's the proper way to live. And in the subconscious, Esav is saying, my path, the path where a person is challenged and has to overcome the challenge, that path is the greater path. Esav is probably right. I'm just not sure that Esav himself was able to live out his potential. And later, a lot of the story what happens later in the story, I think, even though I haven't seen this written explicitly, is Jacob has to step in and assume the role of Esav and Esav's spiritual path, because Esav doesn't live up to a spiritual path. So later in life, even though it turns out that Jacob in the beginning is each time he's a wholesome and complete man, and like Rashi says, you know what wholesome is? Someone who doesn't know how to trick. Now, if I told you of any of the three patriarchs, who would you say doesn't know how to trick? The last person you would think of is Jacob, because Jacob ultimately is going to trick. But part of this is that Jacob has to step in for his twin. So he has to buy the birthright. He has to buy Esav's spiritual challenges. In other words, he has to step in, and his life pushes him to a life of where he has to trick and be tricked, because he has to now live up within himself both paths, where part of him naturally is wholesome, but he's also going to be challenged. Why? Because Esav drops the ball. But again, in the womb, in the source, in the potential, Esav wasn't supposed to drop the ball. Esav was somebody created with tremendous amount of challenge, but not because God is trying to trick him and God is trying to make him fail. To the contrary, God is going to give an opportunity to grow to the position of what Maimonides calls the greater quality, which is the quality of somebody who maybe not be the perfect pious person, but somebody who's able to conquer his negative inclination, in that way be on a much higher level. So that's a little bit about Jacob and Esav in the womb. Now, Mazel Tov, we're going to move a little bit to get to the birth, right? The pregnancy is only 9 months. After that is the birth. Many years ago, when we studied this verse, we had a beautiful, beautiful interpretation. I hope you're listening, Mark, from Kathy Rosenblatt. She gave a very beautiful interpretation. And she said that, Mark, tell me if you remember this, but I remember it. She said that often when you have twins, what happens is that one twin is born physically stronger than the other one, more developed, etc. This is a long time ago, so I'm not 100% sure I remember, but I think what Kathy said is that, ironically, sometimes the one who is weaker is born with stronger lungs because they have to struggle for the oxygen or whatever they need. I think that's what she said. And I think what she said was that that's really what's happening in this verse. You have two people, the two nations fighting, the conflict between them, but then the greater one, the older one, which is the stronger one, is going to serve the younger one. In other words, the younger one, in some sense, is more powerful. The one you would think, the one that ultimately you think is weaker because they're physically not as strong, is actually more powerful because they have to create that endurance. So, Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you said this probably 10 years ago, maybe more. And I still think about it because it's very interesting. So you look at the Jewish people, look at Rome and Jerusalem, and you think about, so who's stronger? Certainly, if you look 2,000 years ago, there's no question. The might of Rome is the stronger might. But then you're talking about endurance. Sometimes the weaker one is actually able to persevere and is actually stronger in spirit. And in the long term of history, Rome is gone and the Jews are still here. So the weaker one is actually stronger because they had to fight for survival, and that makes them stronger. So I may be messing up the interpretation, but I think this was the gist of the interpretation. So please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but it was very beautiful then, and trying to recreate the beauty. I think that was the idea.
Sounds good, Rabbi.
Okay. At least you're not disagreeing with me. That's good. That's good. Okay, wonderful. Okay, now we got to move to the birth. What's the birth? The birth is, let's share the screen. Verse 24. And her days to give birth were completed, and behold, there were twins in her womb. Very interesting Rashi. Why is this so interesting? Because in biblical Hebrew, before we read the Rashi, just a little background here. In biblical Hebrew, there are many words in Hebrew that could be spelled what they call malay, full, or chaser, empty, or missing. So in other words, the same word could be spelled, for example, with a vav or without a vav, because the vav could serve as a vowel, or you don't need the vowel. So if you go and buy a Hebrew dictionary today in the store, at least the ones I saw when I was a kid, today everything is online. But when I was a kid, the dictionary, on the first page, it would say, we are doing a consistent spelling. All the words in this dictionary are spelled complete, meaning with a vav, with a yod, spelled completely, whenever we spell out all the vowels. Other dictionaries would say our spelling is consistent missing. We're not always going to put in the extra vav because the modern Hebrew language wants uniformity. And it could be that Israel by now they picked a choice, they stick to one. I don't know. But you look at biblical Hebrew, and biblical Hebrew is inconsistent. The same word sometimes is spelled with the full letters, and sometimes it's spelled without the full letters, and sometimes twice in the same verse. Sometimes twice in the same verse, the same word could be spelled differently, either full or empty, with the vav or without a vav. Now, Rashi usually does not address it. Usually does not address it. He addresses it once in last week's parsha about the Akeb, about the Luchos, the tablets. We're not going to get into that right now. One place that Rashi does address it is right here. The word twins. And like I always say, the Torah is fascinated by twins because whenever we hear about the birth of twins, there's excitement. And Rashi here is going to contrast the twins of Rebecca to later, we're going to have the twins of Judah and Tamar, which is a very interesting story. Ultimately, Judah has relations with a harlot. He thinks that she's a harlot. Really, it's his daughter-in-law, which he is supposed to marry because her husband's died, a Levirate marriage. The bottom line is, Rebecca has twins, and Tamar has twins. So without getting into the whole Tamar story, I just want to get to this Rashi. What does Rashi say? Here, Tomim, spelled Tomim. In English, in Hebrew, actually, I'm going to retract a second. And it's not a question of full or empty. It's actually a missing letter. I retracted what I said till now. This is actually a missing letter. It's not just the extra vav. So I spoke too early without reading the Rashi. So Rashi points out that the word here, V'nei Tomim, and behold, there are twins in her womb. The word Tomim is missing an aleph. Says Rashi, Tomim is spelled defectively, missing an aleph and yud. Oh, I was right. It's missing both. Okay, it's missing a letter plus the vowel. So what I said is also right. But concerning Tamar, it is written Te'omim with the plain spelling, with an aleph and yud, because they, Peretz and Zerach, were both righteous, but here one was righteous and one was wicked from Genesis Rabbah, from the Medrash. In other words, it's interesting that Rashi is saying here that the extra spelling, you have to look at the word carefully. And even though Rashi himself doesn't always address it, but what it's telling us is there is always a meaning. There's always a reason for this word to be, for the spelling of the word. And it may seem like, oh, it's just dropping a letter. No, there's always a reason, even if Rashi himself does not address it, but maybe it's left for us to address. And the case here, Rashi says it's missing a letter because not everybody was righteous, as opposed to Tamar's twins, where even though that story is a totally strange story, it seems completely immodest, but the reality is both her sons were righteous, and therefore the word twins is spelled complete, whereas here they're not complete because one is wicked, and as we mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean wicked, it means born with wicked tendencies. That's the Hasidic interpretation, born challenged so that they should have the potential to reach the quality of the righteous person the person who overcomes their tendencies. Okay, beautiful. Let's read the birth. Let's read about the birth. And the first one emerged ruddy, like red. He was completely like a coat of hair, and they named him Esav. Esav is like hairy. That's what Rashi says. And it's funny. It says they. Who's they? The plural. Okay, let's hold on. Let's hold that for a second. Afterward, his brother emerged, and his hand was grasping Esav's heel, and he named him Jacob. Then we get to the technicality, the birth date. Now Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. Okay. In other words, like this. In other words, who named Esav? Who named him hairy? That it says in the plural. Jacob, it says, and he named him Jacob, implying supposedly the father. So Rashi says they all called him this because he was complete asui, literally made and fully developed with hair, like one many years old. In other words, Rashi is saying Esav comes from the word asui. It's the same spelling. The pronunciation is different, which means done, complete. A child emerges, he's full of hair. Child emerges is full of hair. So what do we say? He's completely mature. He's completely done. He's done. And that's why everybody calls him Esav, because it's so obvious and it's also so striking. Whereas Jacob's name, not everybody could see that he emerged holding his brother's heel. So there it says Vayikra, he named him Jacob. Presumably it's only the father. So that's the birth, Mazel Tov. We have two sons. Okay. What is happening here? Why is it so important to know that Esav is born hairy? It's nice to explain his name, but how does that capture Esav's personality and Esav's perspective on life. So the commentaries explain as follows. And again, not only Esav, we're going to explain how Esav's being born complete with here captures Esav's perspective on life. And the fact that Jacob is holding the heel captures Jacob's perspective on life. So what the commentaries explain like this, specifically, I'm quoting the Kli Yakar. The Kli Yakar says as follows. He says, look, when it comes to the physical qualities, a child is in some sense born complete. Yes, the child is not the complete in the sense that he's not independent. He still needs the parents to take care of them. But we're talking about the physical qualities. The more physical the quality, the more the child has it. Eating, yes, the child could eat. Drink, the child can eat. Touch, the child can touch. Make noise, the child can make noise. When it comes to physical qualities, the child has them immediately. So if you tell me that the child, Esav, is born and in the physical qualities, he seems complete, what are you telling me? You're telling me that this is a person who his realm is the physical realm. And the physical realm, you can be complete at birth. Again, not complete, but I'm just saying you have everything you need at birth to be able to experience the physical senses. Whereas when it comes to spirituality or ideas or thoughts or abstract thoughts, the child is not complete. That takes time to develop. And if you think about it, the longer, the more time passes, the more a person could achieve the spiritual growth. So for example, to achieve wisdom, in Judaism, wisdom is synonymous with age, because the more the person ages, the more wisdom a person will have. In other words, the spiritual qualities would never emerge in the beginning. They always emerge at the end. They'll always emerge at the later in life more than earlier in life. Whereas the physical qualities, it's the reverse. When the child is young, first of all, they're able to eat and drink. They have the physical parts of their body. And also when they get old, to the contrary, the body is actually weakened, right? They revert back to childhood in some sense. The body is weakened. So what are we saying here? When we say that Esav is somebody that emerges, they're complete. They emerge, he looks like a mature child. It means his realm is the physical. In the realm of the physical, a child is complete. A child then sometimes is more complete than the adults, because the child appreciates the physical and he's worry-free. He's not thinking about ideas. He's not thinking about worrying. He's just thinking about the here and the now and the physical. And if breakfast tastes good, there's no worries. That is a sign of the physical. And that's a sign of Esav. But Jacob holding the heel represents the end of the body. In other words, when it comes to spiritual qualities, you're not going to get the full development immediately. To the contrary, it's going to take much more time for the spiritual quality to develop. So Jacob is almost like holding the heel to represent that Jacob's qualities don't come immediately. It takes time for them to emerge. So that's one interpretation from the Kli Yakar. Another way of explaining it in more different terms, maybe more contemporary terms, is that, take a little different perspective. What does the here represent? The here represents completeness. The person is fully mature. Okay. What is the aspiration of the physical? What does a person want? If you stop somebody in the street and you say, what do you want to achieve? So the aspiration of the physical is to be complete. What does that mean? What do I mean complete? The aspiration of the physical is that I should lack nothing. I should have no worry. I should have no pain. I shouldn't be bored. I shouldn't be bored. I should always have a vacation to go to. I should lack nothing. That is what the physical wants. Now, I'm always part of what I want is I want to be the most dominant, so I have to have more than the other person has. So I always want more because I'm always afraid that I'm going to be lacking. But the bottom line is, what do you want? Stop the person. What do you want? I want to lack nothing. I want what they call shleimut. I want completeness. I want to lack nothing. That's the aspiration of the physical. That's the aspiration of nature. That's why when you say Esav, Esav is born complete because that is the aspiration of Esav's perspective. I want completeness. What is the aspiration of Jacob? The aspiration of Jacob is not complete, not to be complete. The aspiration of Jacob is always to grow because the aspiration of Jacob is to sense that God is infinite. And I'm always trying to connect to the infinity of God, and I'm never going to be able to achieve it because I'm finite and God's infinite. So I always have to struggle to grow and to go beyond myself and push beyond myself because myself, I am never going to be able to reach completeness because it's impossible because completeness from the perspective of Jacob is cleaving to the infinite. And cleaving to the infinite means that I would never have that. There's always more for me to grow. In other words, if you stop Jacob, if you stop Esav and say, what do you want? He says, I want to be complete. If you stop Jacob, you say, what do you want? I want to strive for more. That's how you would describe the difference between Jacob and Esav. No surprise then that Jacob is born complete. I'm sorry, Esav is born complete with the here. The here represents you're already complete. Like Rashi says, Asu, you're finished. You're done, you're finished. Whereas Jacob is born and Jacob feels that I'm holding the heel. I'm always struggling for more. There's always more I want to achieve. I'm trying to get ahead because Jacob senses that I'm in quote unquote, I'm striving to connect to the infinity. So there's no such thing as completeness. I'm never complete. I'm always struggling for more. So in that sense, the way they were born and therefore their names actually represents the story of their life. What do they want? Esav wants to be complete. Jacob always wants to struggle for more. And again, each of us have both a little bit of Esav and both a little bit of Jacob. And there's always a conflict between us, between the Jacob part of himself, the part that wants to transcend, and the Esav part of self, the part that wants to be self-oriented and be grounded in the physical and in the tangible. And ultimately, there's a conflict between the two. And the good news is that at the end of the verse, as you mentioned earlier, we do have the recipe. I wouldn't say to make them equal, even though equality is very popular in today's world, but we're not into equality. They're not on the equal standing, but we could make a recipe for harmony. And that is that the older one means what appears stronger in this world, the physical world, the might of the physical world. The physicality is going to serve the transcendent, the younger one. And that's even within our own self, how we will find peace and harmony. So that's the story in short. A lot more to say. Of course, we'll continue next week, God willing, in good health. So make sure that it's the end of August. So make sure you're enjoying yourself physically, but also you have to make sure that it's for a higher purpose, which is for the older one to serve the younger one, the older one to serve the younger one, that the purpose of all of the physical experiences and pleasure and comfort is for a higher purpose. So that is the story in short. Thank you everybody for joining. And if you're studying Torah on a Sunday morning in the second half of August, I think we're in the second half of August. Yes, the second half of August, it means you're very committed. So that's very impressive. So thank you for joining.
Have a good week, Rabbi.